Is America on the road to communism? Well, the former president thinks so, and many right wing radio hosts have been saying this for a long time, and, well, saying it even before there were right wing radio hosts. Now, many will just dismiss this claim as red baiting, but I want to take a little different tack to this. Let's take the claim seriously, if not literally, for a moment. Now, I want to introduce you to a certain concept I like to think of called the smart version of an argument and the dumb version of an argument. When it comes to debates and discourse, we tend to represent the ideas of those whom we disagree with and maybe even disrespect with the least intellectually credible version of their arguments possible. Now, sometimes those people are giving the least intellectually credible versions of their arguments possible, but sometimes there are actually intellectually credible versions of certain arguments that you think just aren't worth having. An example of this, of course, would be are the Nazi Socialists. Now, there is a dumb version of this argument claiming that the Nazis are socialists, just being, the Nazis called themselves a socialist workers' party, therefore they must be socialists. Well, no, that's a dumb argument. A smart argument, however, would be pointing to the Nazi Party platform, which railed against capitalism, which railed for workers, and also pointing out how much influence the state had over the Nazi economy. Now, that is not, of course, the definitive version of this debate, but it is a much smarter argument than simply the Nazis called themselves socialists. The same thing can be said for this argument here. Is America on the road to communism or socialism? Well, there is a dumb version of this argument, which you hear quite often, but there's also a much smarter, more reasoned and nuanced version of this argument that I think is worth paying attention to. It's worth at least hearing it out rather than simply dismissing it as, these are just right-wing red baiters, pay no mind. And so that's what I want to do in this video. But here's the thing. Socialists and all lefty types are very particular about their version of socialism. Their version of socialism is the only correct version for most of them. And the slightest 0.001% variance between theirs and another definition means that that other version is not real socialism. Well, guess what? Those people are dumb, but they exist, and I'm simply acknowledging that they exist. That's kind of a big thing I do with my channel. I acknowledge the existence of things that people don't like. But since those types of socialists get very anal about their very particular snowflakey brand of socialism, communism, we need to have a very specific definition, and that's what I'm going to go for. And so the working definition of communism and socialism I'm going to be working with comes from Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. In particular, I'm going to focus on the 10 planks of the Communist Party platform as laid out by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. And so what this video is going to do is we're going to go through each of those 10 planks and analyze them a little bit and see, okay, how far along is America to having this particular plank of the platform? Have we already achieved this plank? Have we achieved it at some point in the past? Are the tools there to get it? And so that is what this video is going to be. Oh god. It's hot as balls here in California while I'm filming this, and since I'm filming, I can't have the fan or air conditioning on. So, if you would be so kind as to give this video a like, share the video, and leave a comment down below, that would help the video in the algorithm, and I would really appreciate it. Without further ado, let's see what Karl Marx has to say about what socialism or communism is. Within most definitions of socialism, and I'm including communism under the socialism umbrella here, there is a collective ownership of the means of production. Now, what exactly does collective ownership mean? Well, Karl Marx gives his explanation in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat, organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So for all of you out there who say, collective ownership isn't state ownership is state capitalism, well, according to Karl Marx, you guys are wrong. Marx, of course, is not the only socialist writer, obviously, and of course that's why I said before, every socialist is a snowflake that has their own very specific definition, but like I said, we're going to go with the very specific work of Karl Marx, and that's also probably everyone who's claiming America is further down the road to socialism is probably using this, or at least Karl Marx is their metaphorical standard bearer for what communism is. So we're going to go with this and see how far along it actually is, according to their own standard. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Number 1, the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Okay, so this one, clearly in the United States, this is not the case. Although there is a large segment of land in the United States is owned by the federal government, and they do use the profits of that land for the running of the government, which is essentially, by Karl Marx's own definition, what the government does is for the people. It's semi there, but it's not there in any way in which Karl Marx would have thought of. So, plank 1 of the Communist Party clearly has not been achieved, so no, we are not on the road to socialism based on this. Plank 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Now this is one that gets a little more complicated because the United States does in fact have a progressive income tax. We have had it for over a century now. Now the progressive income tax has in fact been heavier in the past than it is now. So this is one of those areas where we've had it in the past and then lost it, but we still have the legal and constitutional mechanics to achieve this plank. It's just whether or not there is the political will for those in power to actually do it. And so on this ground, I'm going to say we are a 50 to 75% yes on this particular plank. We have the ability to fulfill this plank as our legal system is now. It's just a political will problem. So I'm going to count that more as yes on the road than it is to no on the road. Plank number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. That, of course, has not been done. We do have inheritance taxes and other things to try and take wealth or prevent wealth from moving from one generation to another, but we have not abolished it. We just tax it. Now, of course, if you start taxing inheritance at 100%, then yes, you basically will have it. So this is also another instance of we have the legal mechanisms to achieve this, but we don't have the political will to do it at the moment. So basically, I'm going to rank this as kind of a half achieved. It's like we have the means to do it, we just don't have the will to do it as the legal situation in the United States is right now. It's legally possible, but politically implausible. Plank 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. This one actually gets pretty interesting depending on how deep in the weeds you want to go. Now, one of the underlying assumptions of this particular plank is that a socialist revolution has occurred and succeeded, and they're now sort of reshaping society. And in that circumstance, you would, confiscate all the wealth of those who rebelled against socialism, your socialist revolution, and you would also confiscate the property of all the people who decided to leave the country in order to flee your socialism. Now, due to that presupposition of this plank, we have not achieved socialism according to this plank. However, it gets a little more interesting. For example, the United States has in fact confiscated property from rebels before, namely after the Civil War. Now, obviously, the freeing of the slaves is a kind of confiscation of property. Of course, and again, that property was also then immediately given human rights, so we think of it differently, but that kind of was something that is done. And so we have done this before. And most levels of government in the United States also have the power to confiscate property away from people, but that involves a due process kind of system. And so this plank is mostly unfulfilled, but there are some interesting circumstances in which you could make the argument if you really wanted to that we have done it but aren't currently doing it. However, civil asset forfeiture is something that you could equate to this, but it's not nearly widespread enough for it to fulfill a Socialist Party platform. So I'm going to say a mostly no on this plank. Plank 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Well, we've had the Federal Reserve since 1913. I made a video about that you can watch here. And given that, this is a mostly yes, we actually have achieved this, The Federal Reserve has a monopoly on the issuance of actual legal tender of currency. There are other things out there trying to be money. There were attempts at like the Liberty Dollar. And of course, there are cryptocurrencies now. Of course, the cryptocurrencies don't function as money. They function as more like stocks. And so it's not really money. And although the banking industry isn't technically nationalized, it is functionally under the control of the Federal Reserve, considering all these banks are tied to the Federal Reserve system. They get money from the Federal Reserve, they borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And so I'm going to say that this Plank 5 is mostly yes on its way to achieving socialism. So let's move on to the next plank. Plank number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. This is a historically precedented one in that we've actually have had these in the past. So like back during the American Civil War, President Lincoln nationalized all of the railroads as well as telegraph lines. And so at that time, we did in fact have a state control of communications and transportation. Well, at least of rail lines. I don't think the government took ownership of all horses, but that's just a messing up of the point. So we've done this before, and we did it again during World War I under Woodrow Wilson, who also nationalized all the communication lines and the railroads, as well as several areas of production. And of course, according to Karl Marx, the nationalization of these industries does in fact count as collective ownership. However, we haven't had something like this happen in over a century. We do have publicly owned means of transportation and communication, but they are not the majority of our transportation. Like a modern day version of this plank would mean not only nationalizing railroads, it would also probably involve nationalizing the airlines, and maybe even nationalizing all cars. Like all cars have to be owned by the state, or at the very least, all auto manufacturing has to be owned by the state. So no, we have not achieved this. We had it in the past, but we don't currently have it. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. This is another one in which that we've kind of had this one in the past, but we don't have it directly now. During the 1930s and the New Deal, we kind of had this in the form of like the Civilian Conservation Corps. We had these people who were put to work in order to give them employment and put money in their pockets and whatnot, and they would go clear out old dead woods, clear up land for other things, Tennessee Valley Project, all that stuff. So we kind of had this in the past, but probably not in the exact way Karl Marx would have envisioned. So this is another instance of we used to have it, but don't have it anymore. Plus, collectivizing agriculture is just like the worst idea ever. Like literally every time a socialist state decides to collectivize agriculture, you get a famine. So, that should be the one thing that socialists should be grateful hasn't happened. Plank 8. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So by the wording of this, I'm guessing that it means that everyone is required to work. This isn't a system where some people don't have to work and others do. Basically, it seems like it's going to apply Karl Marx's maxim of, to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It doesn't specify that there has to be a certain amount of labor from everybody, but everybody has to provide something. And so this is one of the ones where we've kind of had this in the past, like with the New Deal and public employment programs and whatnot, but we don't have as much of it now. And so this would be like maybe a 10 to 20% fulfillment, but not in the way that any socialist, especially Karl Marx, would have wanted or imagined it. So this is a mostly no, we haven't achieved it yet. Plank number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Basically, Karl Marx wants to get rid of the distinction between people who work in manufacturing and those who work in agriculture. So basically, get rid of these distinctions. You're not working in two separate industries. You're simply working in different departments of the same industry, which is the entirety of the economy, as a single entity. Basically, it sounds like he thinks every square mile of territory should have the same exact number of people in it. Just in terms of planning, that just doesn't sound like a very feasible idea. It's just a bad idea in general. It also can get super messy. It's like, how should the people be distributed? Are you just making sure there's an equal number of human persons? Do you have to make sure that there's an equal number of people of different ethnicities in a place, or proportional amounts? Does this square mile of territory in the middle of Arizona have to have a proportional number of African Americans as the United States contains, in which case then where are you going to get the African Americans to move there? This is, of course, one of the many reasons why Karl Marx and socialism in general starts to fall apart when you get into the nitty-gritty of, what the communists call praxis. But no, this one, of course, has definitely not been achieved in any means. So let's move on to the final plank. Plank number 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. This is another one that's actually surprisingly far along in terms of the United States' achievement of this socialist plank. For example, free education for all children. Well, in the United States, K through 12 education is free. You can send your kid to a K through 12 school so long as they are of the appropriate age. And at the time Karl Marx wrote this back in 1848, that's probably what he would have expected. But then again, university education was a thing back then, and so university education is not universally free. In California, community college is quote unquote free. It's not actually free, obviously, for reason A, paying for it with taxes, but also B, when you go to a community college in California, you are going to have to pay a registration fee to sign up for classes, and that registration fee is usually a percentage of what the tuition would have been at a full 4-year university. But also in the United States, most colleges are publicly owned, they're publicly run, publicly funded. And so we're much further along with this particular goal than people might want to think. So like you can go your entire educational system without touching a single private entity for education. It's very possible to do it. And with programs like FAFSA, you can get most of your education paid for. And so for this one, I'm going to say it's mostly been achieved. Alright, now that we've gone through the whole thing, let's do it one last time, just in quick succession here. Blank 1, abolition of property in the land and application of all rents and lands to public purposes, not achieved. Blank 2, a heavy progressive graduated income tax, semi-achieved. Abolition of all rights of inheritance, semi-achieved, not quite, not in the way they would have wanted. Confiscation of all property of all immigrants and rebels, not really achieved. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with the state capital and exclusive monopoly, mostly achieved. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, mostly not achieved. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Semi-achieved, it's degraded over time. Equal liability of all labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, mostly not achieved. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution by population over the country, definitely not achieved. Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in present form, combination of education and industrial production, mostly achieved. And so given this, the question of whether or not America is down the road to socialism is rather messy. There are a handful of these that have been mostly achieved. There are a handful that have been semi-achieved, although probably not as much now as they had been at some point in the past. And then there are those that just haven't been achieved at all. So are we down the road to socialism? Now, given all of what we looked at here, clearly America is not yet a communist or socialist country. But I think we have more of the tools to do it than people want to admit or realize. Now, I personally think a lot of these tools that have been put in place to do it are in fact unconstitutional, but that doesn't change the fact that they actually are there. It could be used if the political will existed. And I think the honest person making this statement that America is on the road to socialism, this is what they're trying to say, even if they're not saying it in the most intelligent way. It's that we could go socialist if the people who wanted to do so got their hands on the levers of power. But then again, if the people who wanted America to go socialist got their hands on those levers, we would be in a very different situation than when we are now. So what are your thoughts? Is this a reasonable way to answer this kind of hyperbolic question of is America down the road to socialism? Or is there a better way to look at it? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I want to thank my patrons for sponsoring this video. Their support allows me to make more experimental videos like this that don't have to serve the algorithm. If you're interested in becoming a patron and seeing videos like this early in my other projects, you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to find out more. As little as $2 a month gets you access to videos early and a number of other things, as well as the Discord server. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.